I want to take some time today to talk about web serials. Now, most people are familiar with fantasy books more broadly, the traditional publishing route, the major series that, if you've read fantasy, you've at least heard of. Brandon Sanderson's works, Harry Potter's, the one for young adult fantasy that really got a lot of people into the genre. Even nowadays, with A Court of Thorns and Roses and The Fourth Wing, a lot of the most popular fantasy series are traditionally published. They come from big companies that have professional editors, professional marketing teams, and the authors who are writing tend to be at the very top of their game. And I think a lot of people have good experiences with traditional novels, and they don't see a reason to branch out and try something different. Today, I want to talk about why I think web serials are undervalued when it comes to fantasy, and how for a lot of fantasy readers, I think web serials will scratch an itch that they might not realize that they have. So let's talk about it. First off, what is a web serial? What makes it different than those traditional fantasy books? And at its simplest, a web serial is a format of publishing books. It's a way for an author to regularly and consistently publish chapters as they finish them for a reader base that reads chapter by chapter. It's kind of the episodic approach to writing as opposed to the movie, where you get everything all in all at once. Most people are only ever reading one book at a time, and if they are reading more than that, it's someone who typically is a pretty voracious reader. Web serials are more approachable in some instances, because most of the time, once you get caught up to the story, you'll only ever need to read the one next chapter to know what's going on. And they have enough content, enough meat on them to allow you to really dive in and understand the world in a way that a 300-page book might not. The first fantasy web serial I want to talk about, and it's the one that I think is probably the most daunting on this front, but I think it's kind of a case study for what the genre has and what it can do well, is The Wandering Inn. Now, The Wandering Inn is the largest series book ever written. Nothing comes close. I think if you look across genres, if you look across languages, The Wandering Inn is a class all of its own. I just did a page count recently, trying to figure out how many pages The Wandering Inn is. It comes in at more than 39,000 pages at 275 words a page, and it's only getting longer. I'm confident The Wandering Inn will pass 40,000 full pages soon, and probably 50,000 within the next year or two. Pirate Abba, the author, is just prolific. She writes, or I should say they write, we don't know the gender of Pirate Abba, but they write on average 20 to 30,000 words a week. 60 to 100 pages is a pretty conservative estimate if you were doing traditional publishing. Over the course of a month, Pirate Abba will often have written 300 to 400 pages worth of fantasy. That is an entire book. And people struggle to understand how there's that much story that could be told, right? Oftentimes you are reading a 500-page book and you feel like it didn't have enough things going on for the number of pages that it was. It dragged onwards. It was low intention at points because the characters weren't doing things that you really were interested and engaged with as a reader. But The Wandering Inn's different. Pirate Abba writes the story with so much character work, so many beautiful and well-realized people, that you don't read The Wandering Inn for the plot necessarily. Strange to say, it has a expansive plot that has interesting things happening and characters consistently interacting with each other and with others in bad situations. You have war and you have dungeon delving where these people are going into scenarios that are very scary and creepy. You have discrimination between the different races as drakes and gnolls and humans interact. You have, storylines that branch off from the main storyline and don't connect for the first 10 million words of the story, but that are stories all their own. I think of a character who's on one of the other continents, Beleros, who is a doctor, swore an oath to do no harm, and her working on the battlefield outside of mercenary companies with other people from Earth as she tries to figure out how to survive and do the right thing. That on its own is a great story idea. And Geneva is a well-realized character, and the cast around her are all interesting characters in their own rights, with their own interests and needs and ways that they're interacting with the situation that they're put within that makes it a book worth reading. It doesn't even touch Aaron and the Wandering Inn. It's a side story, but a side story that's better than a lot of books that I've read. When I think about the plot line in Chandrar, one of the other continents, with King Floss, the king of destruction, this man who almost conquered the world, but when 3 of his friends were killed, his generals, he gave it up and he went back and he kind of just moped in his castle for 20 years in a deep depression. He's come back and he's awake again, and he's decided that it is once more time to summon his vassals and conquer. That's a cool story idea, right? Like, Floss's plotline and the twins that are with him from Earth is fascinating, and it's deep and it's complex, and it has politics and it has, war, but it also talks about morals. You get a blacksmith character for a couple chapters that is quite long that's dealing with her family and culture and tradition. It is so deep. And it's such a hard thing to explain to non-web serial fans, because that's how a lot of the web serials can end up feeling. The Wandering Inn's kind of the personification. It's the place to start because it's the most extreme. But it's certainly not the only web serial that can feel like you just never need it to stop, because it has enough complexity and depth and character work to be fascinating. Moving on from The Wandering Inn, I could talk about it all day long. I probably will at some point. I want to talk about the different flavors of web serials. And I put out a few of my favorites that I think kind of personify some of the different elements of the web serial genre. The first thing I want to start with is just kind of the more comical edged ones. I find that sometimes web serials are able to get away with levels of humor, or at least off-the-wall humor that you wouldn't necessarily be able to find from most traditional publishers. I think of the dungeon crawler Carl in the Lit RPG world. Not necessarily a web serial, though if you subscribe to his Patreon, you can read his chapters early. I've done that. But he makes a lot of jokes that are hilarious, that make me laugh, and have complex world building that's kind of funny. But not in a way that I often find traditional publishing companies are going for or looking for. And the web serial I really want to highlight here is A Practical Guide to Evil. Now, A Practical Guide to Evil is about a character, an orphan in a war-torn country that kind of resembles fantasy France, very classic Western fantasy. But they've been conquered 20 years ago by the evil empire, the Nansurians. And I absolutely love the way that Practical Guide to Evil sets up this conflict between evil empires and good empires. And every empire has to be one of those two things. It's kind of passed down by the angels. There's good powers, there's bad powers, and you were one of them. And when people start to personify an idea enough, they can take on a role. So if you're the best archer, you're known for archery, that's you personify being the archer, you might become the archer. And it would be a role. But every role is either a hero or a villain, and things work differently depending on which that it is. It's really quite fascinating. The heroes are not immortal. They don't live forever, but fate just kind of happens to twist and turn and give them the benefit of the doubt. There's constant jokes in the story that if a hero is put into an unsurmountable situation, because of the stories and the history of it, they'll often pull something out of the back of their hat and succeed anyway. It kind of plays off that trope of the main characters always succeeding. And in this story, the character that we follow isn't a hero. She's a villain. And she's a villain that's trying to do the best to help her country, Callow, while they're in the hands of this evil empire, kind of the evil empire. Devil summoners, demon summoners, necromancers. I mean, they're as comically evil as you can get, but she's a part of them. And you follow her as she picks up an evil scientist mage, someone who's determined to uncover the secrets of the world through any means necessary. He was raised by a warlock and his other father, who is a devil. And Masigo has just wild moral inclinations in terms of what's right and what's wrong and what's acceptable. And he is constantly funny. Hakram, her adjutant, her orc leader as she goes into the army, is a huge gossip. And he's her right-hand man, and he's so reliable, and you absolutely love him as a character. But he is a gossip, and he's constantly doing things that make me laugh. You know, when I think about the villains in Practical Guide to Evil, you have, you know, this city where it is run by the people. It's an extreme democracy. And the character that you follow is a diplomat for them that's had a stone implanted in him. And if they ever think that he's treasonous at all, the stone will explode and kill him. And his opening introduction is at this conference of villains, as all the other villains in the conference, all these other cities, one of them's trying to make him explode. They're just trying to say things that they think will prompt his handlers to kill him. And that's kind of the game that they play, is just trying to get them to perish. And there's so much of this that seems on its face to be dark, but in the web serial format where you have chapter after chapter, and it's 7 full volumes, it's a long series, it feels like the characters grow into themselves in such a pure way that makes them all deeply interesting to follow, and it makes the story worth reading. I'm not sure that you could tell something like A Practical Guide to Evil in a classic book format. I don't think it would have gotten published, and I don't think it would have necessarily been as good as it is, with the time and the flexibility of the author to write chapter after chapter that is interesting and funny and off the wall, with a magic system that is as much satire as not. Truly an excellent story. Beyond that, I want to talk about more battle fantasy. These are web serials that are just constant action, and there's really 2 different types of it. The most common one that we find are system apocalypse stories. These are deeply popular, where aliens typically in some variety come down from the sky and conquer Earth all at once and bring them into the galactic system. Oftentimes they're taken out and they have a system that gives them magical abilities of some sort or welcomes them into greater power. And then the main character is competing against other people to gain the heights of power that way and to win the rewards. Defiance of the Fall, Primal Hunter, Azeroth Healer are kind of all within, not Azeroth Healer in this category as much, but those are all within that kind of system apocalypse lens. Azeroth Healer, on the other hand, is more of the main character waking up in a fantasy world from where they were before and deciding that they want to make it they want to do it the right way. So it's very similar to the system apocalypse. You're just not necessarily set on Earth originally. Though neither Primal Hunter nor Defiance of the Fall feel like you're on Earth necessarily. They just take a little bit more direct inspiration from Earth itself. All of these are stories that kind of rely on the main character constantly fighting progressively more dangerous enemies. They're growing in power as they do so, and at the end of each book, it should be pretty clear that the main character could easily win a fight or a battle against themselves at the start of the book. Pretty much always. It's incredibly rare for one of these series to have backtracking progress of that nature, simply because if you're reading it and writing it day after day after day after day, chapters for Primal Hunter release most weekdays, if not all weekdays. I think Defiance of the Fall is the same. There's over 1,000 chapters out for some of these. You can't really have we'll go back for a little bit plot-wise. Most of the time, it's constantly falling upwards, and you're getting new challenges and new locations and new ideas to grapple with, greater enemies, and oftentimes the power cap on there. The most powerful people are so much stronger than a normal person that it's almost hard to comprehend. I kind of like that. I like it when there's no artificial cap on power, because there's always greater places to go, and it's a story that doesn't necessarily need to end. It follows a character as they go from 0 to God, and at some point along that process, the story might run out of gas, but most of the time with these, I don't think that they do. When I think about Primal Hunter, and Defiance of the Fall and Azeroth Healer, all three of them rely on action as their primary driver for entertainment. Constant fighting, constant new abilities, constant power-ups. People like that. But more than that, they all have characters that are interesting. Primal Hunter has Jake meet this outer snake god that is true power in the universe, and they're just kind of besties. And their relationship is comical, and it's funny, and it's enjoyable to read. And if you're already interested in the power-ups, then find the stories that have both the power-ups elements, the growth, the progression, and the humor that makes you smile. Has the elements of the characters that make you cry. I mean, The Wandering Inn has me crying all the time. The story's awesome. And that's kind of what you're looking for, right? So, in conclusion here, it's a lot of ramblings about some of the web serials that I love, but at the end of the day, web serials as a genre have a unique benefit in that, unlike traditional publishing, where the author has the chance to go back and edit chapter by chapter. So at the end, a lot of the times the novel's quality will be identical start to finish because it's been edited. There's no reason for the quality to suffer at the beginning and then grow better at the end. Though we certainly see that sometimes. Most web serials do start rougher. Volume 1 is almost always the worst volume. Book 1 is almost always the weakest book. And I think a large part of it is these are new authors that are trying to get their foot in the door, that are trying to write, and that are learning as they go. And they've realized that you can spin your wheels in the background forever. You can write, and you can talk about writing, and you can revise. But if you're never publishing anything, then you're never inviting criticism. You're never inviting the opportunities for real growth. And that when web serial writers continue writing and they make it, their stories end up getting very, very good because they write consistently on a regular basis. They take regular feedback. They have a reader base that is excited to read what they have, and they're excited to write it for them. And that combination, I think that feeding back and forth often creates a greater product than it would on its own. And I've read a lot of web serials. Some of them are not that way. I've read many that start all right and then maybe they'll get worse, but oftentimes those aren't the popular ones because the web serials that stand out to people and stand the test of time and get long enough to have true followings, almost always the author is improving. And the end chapters, if you're reading along with the author, are excellent. They are so good. It's really hard not to be excited to read a story that you love, that you already are 12 plus books into. You're excited about the characters before you even pick up the story, and then the author just does a consistent job of making it better. And if every book is better than the last, man, what's better than that in a series? I hate reading a trilogy where I love book 1 and book 2's fine, and then book 3 is just like a disappointment. Like, how often is that the case? Web serials, I don't experience that. I don't get the Dresden effect where, we're 10 books in and suddenly the story just starts going on weird curves and I'm not enjoying it nearly as much. And if that is the case, I move on to the next web serial. It's all a matter of taste. It's all a matter of flavor. But if you haven't picked up a web serial, if you've never given it a try, a lot of great ways to read online for free. Royal Road is a site that I love. Oftentimes the authors will have websites of their own, either just like a blog or a website that they'll post on, and you can read the chapters there. That's the other thing about web serials. Unlike most books, if you are okay with just reading them, you don't have to pay to do so. There's no paywall. It's free content for people to enjoy and love. And that's what I found myself at. I love web serials. I find them fascinating. I find them to be the genre of the future. Something that couldn't have been done before the internet and couldn't exist before even just the last couple of years. It's a new frontier, and I'm excited to explore it. And I